How's it going, my Saab friends? My name is Gary and this is my channel Weakest of Weeks. If you're a first-time viewer, I appreciate you clicking on the video and definitely consider subscribing. I have a ton of how-to stuff out there, and especially Saab-related videos. And without some long intro, let's just go ahead and get right into it and show you what we're going to be installing today. Here we have two different snails to feast your eyes on that'll work on any 2.8 liter V6 turbo Saab. Here we have a 15T totally factory Saab turbo with a 55.69 millimeter compressor wheel size. This is a massive upgrade. This is considered a 22T or also an 18G, which ups that compressor wheel size to 68 millimeters. Now there is a super common upgrade that actually falls in between here, and you may have heard of it before, and it's considered a 19T. So where you have this factory 15T at 55.69 millimeter size, the 19T in between here jumps up to 58 millimeter, and then this massive 22T or 18G ups it to 68 millimeters. So a large improvement. If you want to go more in depth of what all goes into upgrading your Saab turbo or where to get one, please take a pause and go to bcinnovate.com. My friend Brennan Cutler hooked me up and basically gave me a crash course on upgrading these turbos. Super wealth of knowledge. And if you're interested in purchasing one of the turbos from him, on his website bcinnovate.com, use coupon code WEAKESTOFWEEKS to save 75 bucks. So let's quit rambling and go ahead and upgrade to ditch our factory 15T to the 22T or 18G. Before we install, just a quick up-close comparison. Probably hard to denote on the camera without having a caliper on hand, but this is the factory 15T with that small 55.69 millimeter compressor wheel, and then the massive upgrade, which includes this new wheel and then machining out this inlet to accept that 68 millimeter size. Big improvement up front. Hard to see on the back, but Brennan will ditch this factory wheel on the back and goes with a 9 blade for better flow, and then among that upgrades the internal. So if you're seriously in the market for upgrading your turbo, definitely consider Brennan, bcinnovate.com. I'll quit rambling. Let's go ahead and start tearing apart this factory turbo. Starters, will pull off this trim cover for the battery. Normally you'd have like a Phillips trim clip in both of these. Mine are long gone, so it literally just lifts up. Move that to the side. Now for the battery, 10 millimeter nuts on both the positive and negative. Sadly, 1 minute into this disassembly, I've run into my first hurdle, that being this battery tie down portion here. Take a 13 millimeter bolt. I was able to loosen it a little bit, but not enough to actually get the battery out. What is happening is the nut from underneath is just spinning. So how we're going to remedy that, take this air intake, remove it to the side. Now I'm going to have to squeeze my hand underneath and around this battery tray, and I can ever so slightly get my fingers on what it is spinning from underneath. So I'm going to try to hold it from underneath and undo this 10 millimeter from the top and see how far we get. Here's that battery tie down. This is that portion that goes underneath that I had to get my hand on as I undid this on the top. The only thing is, when it comes to reassembly, I'm not exactly quite sure how I'm going to manage getting this back in. Now we have 3 T40 torque screws to remove. Now I will say, a couple days ago I sprayed what I could with the turbo with penetrating oil, let it soak, and I just did that again, and especially now that I was able to remove the battery and get access to these 3 rusty bolts. So I think, being a car from the north, this is imperative to use penetrating oil, so I'm going to let that soak in for a minute, and then we'll go ahead and remove these 3 bolts. Those 3 bolts removed. Now you push in on this tab and then wiggle this relay box up and it comes out. And then we need to remove this wiring harness, which that just lifts out of its channel. And this is pretty well loose. All right, this next portion is kind of crazy. I've never really seen anything like it, but this whole tab lifts up. So get your hand, lifts up like that. And then this is now free. And the whole front of this battery tray is now loose. So I have a zip tie here. I'm going to cut that. And then I think it should be free and clear to remove this battery tray. Got the sensor for the hood, so that'll alert you if the hood is open. So that's just a simple pigtail. Pull out on that, and then there's it removed. Remove the engine cover to give us better access over here. Move the oil cap, lift up on this engine trim plate, set it to the side. I always put the oil cap back on here. That way nothing falls down into the crankcase, and that gives us more access to this heat shield for the turbo. I'm going to go ahead and push this in to remove that pigtail. This looks like it's just gonna fall out. Otherwise, sometimes you need to use a trim removal tool to get that out. Okay, let's tab up top, push that down. That kind of goes to the side. Move the wires to the side as well. That gives us access to this intake clamp. I have a 9/32. While we're at it, there's another clamp way down there. Go ahead and loosen this up. Okay. I have a 10 mil up top here. Now this guy is super brittle, so definitely need to be careful removing it. So wiggle it back and forth, pop up like that, and let me show you what I'm going to do. I'm just literally going to rotate it to right around there. There is a zip tie here, so that's going to limit our motion, but I think that is out of the way. You don't want to bend this too much. This gets real dry, brittle, real easy to break. Now we'll remove some banjo bolts here. We'll remove some of the heat shield bolts. Now I did notice mine is missing a bolt. Probably hard to see. Right there, there should be another bolt. So I may be able to avoid removing this overflow tank. I may be able to just pop it up just to kind of finagle this out here, but just expect another bolt to be down here that mine apparently does not have. 10 mil. Try to break this loose. Oh no, that sucks. That broke. Other heat shield bolts. And I have this one way down in here. Alright, we got this bolt right here, and if you're wondering as far as angles, these hoses come from the overflow tank. This is that turbo heat shield, so it's right here. This line leads to the actual turbo. So we'll go ahead, loosen this bolt. Also a 10 mil. This is where things are going to get somewhat messy. We got to remove these banjo bolts for the oil and the coolant lines, and I have some shop towels in kind of my little disposable container here, so I'm going to try to catch what I can, but realistically it's probably just going to drip down. But we'll go ahead and just start with one of these and see how far we get. Before I get too carried away and continue the process of removing this turbo, now that this heat shield's out of here, I get access to that broken stud inside this other heat shield. At first I thought it was actually in the exhaust side of the turbo, but fortunately it's just part of this turbo housing. So I'm going to sit here and drill it out, and the end result that I'm shooting for is to put a M6 rib nut in here, and then I have kind of a matching, almost factory looking style bolt to go in here. So hopefully I'll be able to easily drill this out and put in the rib nut. I'm not gonna lie, that was a giant pain, because there's actually a nut on the back side of here that's, I guess, welded to this heat shield. And then of course this is the broken stud, the other portion of that bolt that broke. So initially I thought I'd be able to drill that. I started to drill it, and then I realized after a while I'm actually going through this and it's just too difficult to drill. So I got in behind or underneath here with the Dremel and cut off this little piece and just use the pliers to pry that off. So now we're good to insert a rib nut. If you don't have a rib nut gun yet, go ahead, do yourself a favor, click the link in the description and go ahead and purchase yourself one. These come in handy for a lot of different things, and especially in this case to repair this heat shield. There it is, now repaired. So now I'm actually gonna bend up temporarily this heat shield we just repaired, mainly just to get access to, there's a E-clip in behind here to loosen up the lever to this wastegate. So we're just gonna bend this up. Not gonna be gentle, but that'll give us a little more room to get this clip off. So I'm gonna try to get a magnetic tool underneath here, so when we pop this clip off and it falls down, hopefully this magnetic tool catches it. Wah, wah, wah. That didn't work. Okay, now we're ready to loosen the turbo up. We got this clamp with two 10 mils, one on this side and one that's a little harder to get access to on the other side. Now we're ready to break this turbo free of the exhaust housing, and if yours gets stuck, definitely use some penetrating oil in that seam where that clamp was, and you may need to get like a block of wood like such, and you can kind of just place it like this, obviously away from these lines, and then I kind of push this to the side and smack this portion with the hammer. That way it's just the softwood up against this turbo housing and you don't mar it up with the hammer. But now we're good to finalize the removal of these banjo bolts. Right now they're just pretty well loose, and then this should be, yep, pretty loose. And then once we get this whole assembly out, we'll transfer over all this other stuff. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and take out this silicone intake piece, and that'll give us more room to get this assembly out. One thing I forgot, underneath the turbo, there's another two 10mm bolts for this tube. There's one on this side, and then one that's going to be rather tricky to get to down there. Now I got both those two 10 mils underneath this turbo out, and I will say if you don't have a ratcheting maneuverable 10 mil wrench, then now's the time to buy one. It was perfect to get down in here and to loosen those bolts up. So now this turbo assembly should actually remove. Haha! And one final pigtail. There it is. Turbo is removed. A little rusty and crusty in here, but that's honestly to be expected. Kind of bummed about that E-clip. It fell somewhere down in there. Hopefully I can find it. If not, I'll have to run to the store and buy a new one. I need to clean off this old gasket material. I believe that's the oil return line, and Brennan actually provides a new gasket for that. We just need to clean up this old one, and then it's on to reassembly. While I was cleaning up the gasket mating surface for the oil return line, I was soaking these 10mm bolts in PB Blast, so hopefully that'll knock these out, but realistically we're probably going to break one of these. These bolts are super common. As you can see, they're relatively rusty now, but hopefully, fingers crossed, these bolts will move fine. Well, that's not a good sign. First one is broke. Alright, well, 2 I removed fine, 1 unfortunately broke. So these 2 bolts are actually 12 mils. Alright, now ready for this valve right here. If you're wondering as far as orientation, if you forget, the pigtail faces the same way the outlet is, and you know how I broke those bolts right here? Well, I don't want to reuse the rusty and crusty ones. I had some replacements laying around. Unfortunately, I don't know the specs of these, but if you go to your local hardware store or auto parts store, you should be able to match something up similar. Not quite the same, but it's a pretty common thread. I believe this is M6 with a 10mm head, and then I put a little bit of anti-seize on each of these in case I ever want to take these off. So we'll go ahead and start these by hand, and then we'll cinch them down. There it is, ready to go back in the car. Now it's reverse order with the turbo now assembled, so I'm just going to set this clamp sort of in place, just kind of draped. I'm not going to put this bolt in just yet because I think it's going to make it too difficult to get the new turbo in here, so we'll just let that hang out. Alright, turbo is right here. The provided gasket, make sure it lines up with the center drain hole, and we'll kind of drape this in here while setting it on that line, but we're not going to push it into the exhaust housing just yet. I want to start the 2 10mm bolts before we proceed any further. This is difficult to showcase in the vehicle, but here is an extra exhaust housing for a turbo I have. But one thing that I wanted to point out, there is a small protrusion right there around this ring, and then on the back side of the turbo, there's a small indentation right there that the turbo has to be clocked a specific way, and if it is not, well then it's not going to line up properly. So it'll actually, in theory, be a little bit closer than that. But if this is not lined up, not only will your lower hot side charge pipe not line up properly, but the actual clamp securing these two together will not hold properly. Alright, I have a feeling I may drop this new clip, so I'm going to try to shove the towel somewhat down in there in case it does fall. Hopefully this will catch it. Probably not. Okay, so I picked out the clip that I think will work. And now we'll just try to ever so carefully get this in place. Look at that. I didn't even drop it. All right, next up we have a couple different things going on. Before we forget, we need to get this pigtail plugged in. That goes to this valve. That's clipped in. Next up, we'll do this, I believe it's the Overboost Solenoid. So we have a long hose at the bottom. That goes to the nipple sticking out on the turbo. Down in there. A straight piece goes into the wastegates, goes like such. Now I'm going to do the hot side charge pipe. Alright, now I think we're ready for the heat shield. And then to finally fasten the rest of these banjo bolts. It's not a bad idea to pour a little bit of oil down in here so that way the first start is not dry. Tighten this upper coolant hose. Verify the bottom one is tight. Yep. I need to bend this portion of the heat shield back down. Got the heat shield back in place. I put anti-seize on the stud down here, anti-seize on the repaired bolt up here, and then anti-seize on the back bolt as well. Tell you what, this ratcheting maneuverable 10mm wrench is the real MVP of this install. Also, can't forget the 10mm bolt holding up this coolant line. Delicately push this back into place, and then the bracket over top of it, and reattach the 10mm bolt. Plug that back in, and it just lifts up into that bracket like such, and then this remaining rubber hose will plug into the intake, and then this, one of these. Okay, get the intake back in here. Actually, I'm going to remove that, tighten this clamp. Can't forget about the clamp going to the mass airflow sensor. Tighten that, hook this plastic line up, and then we're on the home stretch. Now's a good time to just double check your work. Make sure your bolts are tightened, all that, all your lines are in place. Again, I am not going to be putting the other heat shield bolt underneath this overflow back in there because it was in fact missing, and this is going to get torn apart anyways in a future video because I plan to do a down pipe in a mid pipe. But we'll go ahead and just visually check everything, kind of wiggle some stuff. All these banjo bolts are tight, the turbo clamp is tight, all these pigtails are attached, the rubber hose are attached, MAF's plugged in. I mean, we didn't unplug that, but the clamp is still good. That line is good to go. Make sure there's no breaks in this one. That is good. So now that the visual inspection's done, we're now ready to reattach the battery tray. Now, if you remember, when it came to the battery tray removal, this just spun and I had to get in behind here to hold this kind of plastic nut thing. So if you're wondering how I fix this, and I say fix in air quotations because I pretty much just rigged this, but I drilled 4 small holes, put some zip ties through it, and now instead of being this way, this little plastic guy is this way, so there's still a plastic channel there, and then those zip ties just hold it up into there. So once you loosen this bolt, this isn't going to drop down. In theory, it should keep it nice and tight underneath this battery tray. Keeping up with the theme of using anti-seize on this rusty stuff, I'm using more anti-seize, and we're going to line up all 3 of these bolts up first, and then we will cinch them down. And these are T40 Torx. Alright, can't forget to plug in this switch. Okay, and then there was a zip tie on this line back here, so got a new zip tie. Tighten the hold down, that's a 13 mil. Now for the positive cable. And the negative. Final steps are all the trim pieces. As you put the oil cap back on, we'll remove it. The intake. And the battery cover, which I need to find the 2 pins for that. There you have it. Before we start, we obviously have to top everything off with fluids again. We'll start with the coolant. I got this really cool funnel. If you've never seen it before, I will link it in the description, but it's super handy. It has multiple different attachments. Got some GM Dex Cool. Pop out the center piece, fill it up. For the time being, it's topped off on antifreeze. I double checked the oil level. We're good on that. I'm going to leave this funnel in place, and I'm going to start the vehicle for the first time since we installed this new turbo, and I'm going to let the coolant system burp all that air out, and then we'll top it off. There's a bit of smoke at first just from some of the spilled coolant residue, but outside of that, so far so good. Might be done with the air bubbles, but we'll let it run for a little bit just in case. So it is officially another day. It got rather late installing that big 22T turbo, and quite honestly, I wanted to drive the car around for a little bit to see how it would react with just slapping the turbo on it, and I'm more than pleased. So I figured the car would kind of go in this like relearn phase to sort of adapt within reason to that new turbo, and it seems to have worked. At first, the low end, it kind of stumbled a little bit, but after putting roughly 40 miles on it, that's kind of since gone away. It's just, I'm not going wide open throttle by any means, because that's kind of a dangerous thing. I mean, think about it. You're adding a large turbo on it. You're force feeding the engine more air. Well, you need to tune to add more fuel to compensate for that. If it's a scenario where it's getting too much fuel, that's one thing. You're just going to have worse miles per gallon. You're just going to have more carbon buildup on the spark plugs and possibly like black smoke out your exhaust. But whenever you're in a lean situation where you have too much air and not enough fuel, well, then you're going to run the engine lean and burn out valve seats and other stuff. So it's just not good going into lean conditions. So putting 40-ish miles on the car, driving around town just real conservatively, I'm more than happy doing that, but I'm avoiding wide open throttle until I can get a tune. And speaking of tunes, if you guys have any comments as far as who you would recommend and who you like for a tuner, by all means drop a comment down below. Now I will say I have been in communication with a tuner that I'm very pleased with and I've pretty much committed to. We discussed the power goals with this car, which in a nutshell, I'm going with a conservative tune. I'm not shooting for the moon. For now, I'm very happy with the car, so having an extra couple horsepower, I'm very excited to get. It's something that I've been wanting for a long time. I will likely do a catless downpipe and mid-pipe coming up here in about a month's time span. So right after I install that, then I'll have full commitment to the tuner and we'll tune the car. There's potentially a chance I'll upgrade the injectors, but if I get to that point, I'll likely upgrade the fuel pump. If you recently saw my one video where I talked about the fuel pressure sensor and the check engine light associated to it, I haven't had that code come back up, but it does have me leery about, is my fuel pump failing? So that's something that I'm considering as well. Once we do get to the tuning phase and the data logging, what the tuner will tell me about the health and state of my fuel pump. So I think I want to keep things on the lesser side of the cost range. So upgrading injectors to what the tuner wants is easily another $700, and if I have to put a fuel pump, that's another like $400 or $500. So realistically, I probably won't go the route of upgrading the fuel injectors, but at a minimum, definitely a catless downpipe and mid-pipe and then the tune. But if you have any recommendations of who you like tuned your Saab, by all means drop a comment down below and I'd love to hear your suggestions. Stay tuned. Be sure to subscribe for the previous how-to videos like this one if you like this how-to thing I'm doing, and also subscribe because I'm going to have more installs coming up here in the future. If the video helped you out, be sure to give it a giant thumbs up. I appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you friends next time.